For almost 3 years, the Idaho murders case seemed to have a definitive ending. Bryan Kohberger stood in an Idaho courtroom, admitted to murdering 4 University of Idaho students, accepted 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, and brought one of the most closely watched criminal cases in America to an abrupt conclusion. There would be no trial, no jury, no months of testimony, no dramatic cross-examinations. The man accused of the murders had confessed. The case was over. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Now Bryan Kohberger is asking the courts to erase that confession. The same guilty plea that spared him from the death penalty is now at the center of a new legal battle. Kohberger says he is innocent. He claims he was convinced to falsely confess through coercion, misinformation, false promises, and ineffective legal representation. He also alleges that evidence favorable to his defense was not properly disclosed before he agreed to plead guilty. If those claims sound extraordinary, it's because they are. But before anyone assumes the Idaho murders case is heading back to trial, there's one critical fact that cannot be overlooked. Nothing has changed, not yet. Bryan Kohberger is still a convicted murderer. His guilty plea still stands. His 4 consecutive life sentences remain in effect, and no judge has ruled that any of his new allegations are true. So why has this case suddenly returned to the headlines? Can someone who admitted guilt under oath really take it all back? And after everything that's happened, could one of the biggest murder cases in recent American history actually find its way back into a courtroom? Those questions have become the latest chapter in a story that millions believed had already reached its ending. But to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the decision that changed everything. Not the murders, not the investigation, not the arrest. The guilty plea. Because that single decision is now the biggest obstacle standing between Bryan Kohberger and the trial he says he wants. For more than 2 years, the Idaho murders case appeared to be moving toward an inevitable courtroom showdown. Every hearing drew national attention. Every newly unsealed document was dissected online. Legal analysts debated DNA evidence. Former investigators examined surveillance footage. Retired prosecutors predicted how the state would present its case. Families prepared themselves for what many expected would be one of the longest and most emotionally difficult murder trials in recent memory. The prosecution intended to seek the death penalty. The defense was preparing to challenge the state's evidence. And the public expected to finally hear every detail of an investigation that had captivated the country since 4 University of Idaho students were found stabbed to death inside their off-campus home on November 13, 2022. Then, just weeks before that process was expected to begin, everything changed. Bryan Kohberger accepted a plea agreement. Standing before the judge, he admitted responsibility for the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to remove the death penalty from the table. The result was immediate. 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a sentence for burglary, and a criminal trial that would never happen. For prosecutors, the agreement guaranteed that Kohberger would spend the rest of his life behind bars without the uncertainty that comes with asking a jury to impose a death sentence. For some of the victims' families, it meant they would never have to sit through months of graphic testimony and years of appeals that often follow capital cases. For others, however, the agreement felt deeply unsatisfying. Not because Kohberger escaped prison. He didn't. But because so many questions would likely remain unanswered forever. Why those 4 students? Why that house? Did investigators ever determine a motive? Did Kohberger specifically target one victim, or was the attack planned differently? Those are the kinds of questions that often receive answers during a trial. Instead, the case ended with a confession, and once that happened, prosecutors no longer had to publicly present every piece of evidence they had gathered. The legal battle was over, or so it seemed, because nearly a year later, Bryan Kohberger made a move almost no one expected. He announced that he wanted the guilty plea erased. When news first broke that Kohberger had filed a petition for post-conviction relief, the headlines spread quickly. Bryan Kohberger says he's innocent. It was a remarkable statement. Not because defendants rarely claim innocence. That happens every day. What made this different was who was making the claim. This wasn't someone convicted after a jury trial insisting the wrong verdict had been reached. This was a man who had personally admitted guilt in open court, who had answered a judge's questions under oath, who had accepted life in prison to avoid the possibility of execution. Now he was asking the legal system to disregard all of it. In his handwritten petition, Kohberger alleges that he was persuaded to falsely confess through coercion, false promises, misinformation, and ineffective legal representation. He also claims that evidence favorable to his defense was withheld during plea discussions, preventing him from making an informed decision. Those allegations immediately reignited public debate. Supporters of the prosecution argued that Kohberger was attempting to undo a plea agreement only after securing the benefit of avoiding the death penalty. Others questioned whether the court should at least examine the claims before dismissing them. The legal system, however, doesn't decide cases based on public opinion. It doesn't matter whether millions of people believe Kohberger is guilty, and it doesn't matter whether others believe his latest claims. The court has only one responsibility: to determine whether his petition raises legitimate legal issues that justify disturbing convictions already entered by the court. That is a far narrower question than many people realize, because this proceeding is not about deciding who committed the murders. It is about deciding whether Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea was constitutionally valid, and those are two very different questions. That distinction is about to become the most important issue in the entire case. Because before a judge ever considers whether Kohberger deserves another trial, the court must answer something much more fundamental. Was his guilty plea legally sound, or was it fatally flawed from the very beginning? One of the biggest misconceptions surrounding Bryan Kohberger's latest filing is that the court is preparing to decide whether he committed the murders. It isn't. At least, not yet. That distinction is easy to miss because the headlines have focused almost entirely on one sentence. Bryan Kohberger says he's innocent. It's a statement that naturally grabs attention. But in legal terms, the court's first job is much narrower than deciding guilt or innocence. Before any judge considers whether this case should ever return to trial, the court must answer a different question. Was Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea constitutionally valid? That may sound like a technical distinction, but it changes everything. If the plea was entered knowingly, voluntarily, and with effective legal representation, the convictions remain in place. If the court determines there was a serious constitutional problem with the plea process, only then does the possibility of further proceedings begin. That's why this case isn't really about the murders anymore. It's about the decision that ended the prosecution before a jury ever heard the evidence. And that's exactly where Kohberger's petition focuses its attention. Although the headlines often reduce the petition to a single claim of innocence, the legal filings paint a much broader picture. Every argument points toward one objective: to convince the court that the guilty plea should never have been accepted. The first claim is the one everyone has heard. Kohberger now says he is innocent. That declaration stands in direct conflict with what happened in court. When he entered his guilty plea, he admitted responsibility for the murders under oath. Those admissions became part of the official court record. Today, he argues they should not. The second claim is that his plea was not truly voluntary. According to the petition, Kohberger alleges that he was subjected to pressure, misinformation, and false promises before agreeing to plead guilty. That doesn't automatically mean unlawful coercion occurred. Every defendant facing a potential death sentence experiences enormous pressure. The legal question is whether that pressure crossed the constitutional line and prevented a voluntary, informed decision. That's a question the court, not the public, will eventually have to answer. The third claim concerns his attorneys. Kohberger argues that he received ineffective legal representation during one of the most important decisions of his life. Claims of ineffective assistance of counsel are among the most common grounds for post-conviction relief in the United States. They're also among the hardest to prove. The law sets an exceptionally high standard. It's not enough to argue that lawyers could have handled the case differently. A defendant generally must show that counsel's performance fell below constitutional standards and that those alleged failures affected the outcome. In this case, the decision to plead guilty instead of proceeding to trial. That's a difficult burden in any criminal case. In one involving years of preparation, extensive pretrial litigation, and experienced defense counsel, it becomes even more challenging. The fourth claim centers on evidence. Kohberger alleges that evidence favorable to his defense was not properly disclosed before he accepted the plea agreement. That allegation has generated enormous attention online, with many people assuming it means investigators uncovered proof that someone else committed the murders. There is no public court finding supporting that conclusion. In reality, the dispute is much narrower. The petition argues that certain evidence should have been disclosed or handled differently before the guilty plea was entered. Whether any such evidence existed, whether prosecutors had a legal duty to disclose it before the plea, and whether it would have changed Kohberger's decision are all questions the court must examine. At this stage, those remain allegations, not established facts. Ironically, one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in this case may not come from DNA, or cell phone records, or surveillance footage. It may come from Bryan Kohberger's own voice. When defendants plead guilty in American courts, judges don't simply accept the paperwork. They speak directly to the defendant. The conversation is deliberate. Every question serves a purpose. Do you understand the charges? Have you discussed this case with your attorneys? Are you satisfied with their representation? Has anyone threatened you? Has anyone made promises beyond the written agreement? Do you understand that you're giving up your right to a trial? Finally, the question that matters most: are you pleading guilty voluntarily? Those answers become part of the official record, and that's precisely why they're so important today. If Kohberger answered yes when asked whether he understood the plea, and no when asked whether anyone had forced him, the court will naturally compare those sworn answers to the claims he is making now. That doesn't mean his petition automatically fails. People can, under some circumstances, challenge statements made during plea hearings. But it does mean the burden becomes much heavier. His legal team must explain why the court should now reject answers that Kohberger himself gave under oath. That's no small task. In many post-conviction cases, the plea hearing transcript becomes one of the most important pieces of evidence. Every question, every answer, every acknowledgement, all of it may now be scrutinized more closely than ever before. Then came another headline. The court appointed new counsel for Bryan Kohberger. Almost immediately, social media filled with speculation. Some people assumed it meant the judge believed Kohberger's claims. Others wondered whether a new trial was already being planned. Neither assumption was correct. The appointment of new counsel is a procedural step, not a ruling on the merits of the petition. In fact, it often makes practical sense. After all, Kohberger is arguing that his previous attorneys provided ineffective assistance. If that's one of the central allegations, asking those same lawyers to defend their own conduct would create an obvious conflict of interest. Independent counsel allows the claims to be evaluated without that conflict. It protects the integrity of the process. It does not indicate that the court agrees with the petition, nor does it suggest that the convictions are about to be overturned. Instead, it signals something much simpler. The court intends to give the petition the legal review it is entitled to receive before making any decision. For the victims' families, that means another chapter in a case they believed had finally ended. For prosecutors, it means preparing to defend not only the investigation, but also the validity of the guilty plea itself. And for Bryan Kohberger, it means the legal battle he thought he had avoided by pleading guilty may have only entered a different courtroom. But even if every allegation in the petition is carefully reviewed, one question still remains. How likely is it that any of this actually changes the outcome? Because that's where the law becomes even more demanding. This is where public expectations and legal reality begin to separate. When people hear that Bryan Kohberger wants to withdraw his guilty plea, it's natural to imagine the case racing back toward a dramatic courtroom trial. But that's not how the process works. The filing of a petition is only the beginning. It is not a ruling. It is not evidence that the court believes the claims. And it certainly is not a ticket to a new trial. The legal system starts from the opposite position. It begins with the assumption that Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea was valid. Why? Because guilty pleas are not accepted casually. Before a judge accepts a plea in a case of this magnitude, the court must be satisfied that the defendant understands exactly what is happening. The judge doesn't simply ask whether the defendant wants to plead guilty. The court determines whether the defendant understands the charges, the consequences of the plea, the rights being waived, and the sentence that will follow. The judge also seeks to ensure that the plea is voluntary and not the product of unlawful coercion. Those safeguards exist because a guilty plea permanently changes the course of a criminal case. Once accepted, there is no jury, no opening statements, no cross-examination, no verdict. The plea becomes the conviction. That is why courts are generally reluctant to disturb one after sentencing. Doing so requires far more than second thoughts. It requires a legally recognized reason to conclude that the plea should never have been accepted in the first place. And that is exactly what Kohberger now has to prove. If this case moves deeper into post-conviction proceedings, prosecutors are expected to argue that nothing about the plea process violated the Constitution. While their detailed response will depend on the claims before the court, the public record already provides insight into the arguments they are likely to emphasize. First, they can point to the plea hearing itself. That hearing was not conducted behind closed doors or through informal negotiations. It took place in open court, before a judge, with Bryan Kohberger answering questions under oath. Those answers matter. If Kohberger confirmed that he understood the agreement, had discussed the case with his attorneys, and was entering the plea voluntarily, prosecutors are likely to argue that those sworn statements deserve significant weight. Second, prosecutors are likely to emphasize that plea agreements often involve difficult choices. A defendant facing the possibility of a death sentence may decide that accepting life imprisonment is the better option. That decision, by itself, does not make the plea involuntary. The law recognizes that defendants often make strategic decisions after weighing the risks of trial against the certainty of a negotiated sentence. The existence of pressure is not the same as unlawful coercion. Finally, prosecutors are expected to challenge the factual and legal basis of Kohberger's allegations. If they believe evidence was properly disclosed, or that the defense had access to the information required by law before the plea was entered, they will almost certainly argue that there is no constitutional defect requiring the convictions to be set aside. Ultimately, both sides will present legal arguments supported by the record, and the court, not television commentators or social media, will decide whether those arguments have merit. While lawyers debate constitutional standards and court procedures, another group has been forced back into the spotlight. The families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. When Kohberger pleaded guilty, many believed they had finally reached the end of an exhausting legal journey. The grief would never disappear, but the uncertainty had. There would be no months-long capital trial, no years of death penalty appeals, no constant return to the courtroom. The plea agreement, while controversial for some, brought a degree of legal certainty. That certainty has now been shaken. Following Kohberger's latest filing, several family members publicly criticized his attempt to withdraw the plea, describing it as another painful chapter in a case they believed had finally reached its conclusion. Their reactions are understandable. Every new filing means renewed media attention. Every court hearing brings another wave of headlines. Every headline forces them to revisit the worst period of their lives. It's an aspect of the justice system that often receives less attention than the legal arguments themselves. For courts, these proceedings are about constitutional rights and legal standards. For families, they are deeply personal reminders that even after sentencing, some cases continue to echo for years, and that tension lies at the heart of nearly every post-conviction case. The legal system has an obligation to protect the rights of defendants, even after conviction. It also has an obligation to deliver justice through fair and reliable outcomes. Balancing those responsibilities is never easy, especially in a case that has remained under such intense public scrutiny. At this moment, the Idaho murders case stands at an unusual crossroads. The convictions are final. The sentences are being served. Yet the legal process continues. Bryan Kohberger has asked the court to set aside the guilty plea that ended one of the most closely watched criminal cases in modern America. Whether he succeeds will depend not on public opinion, internet theories, or media coverage, but on what the court concludes after reviewing the law, the evidence, and the record of the plea proceedings. As of today, no judge has granted his request. No conviction has been overturned. No new trial has been scheduled. Bryan Kohberger remains a convicted murderer, serving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. What has changed is not the verdict. It's the question. For years, people asked whether Bryan Kohberger would be convicted. That question was answered when he pleaded guilty. Now, a different question has taken its place. Can a man who admitted guilt under oath convince a court that his own confession should no longer stand? The answer won't define whether the murders occurred. It will define whether the legal process that ended this case was as final as everyone once believed. And until the court reaches that decision, the Idaho murders case remains in an unusual position. The criminal prosecution is over, but the legal story isn't. If you found this documentary informative and appreciate fact-based reporting that carefully separates verified evidence from allegations and speculation, please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue producing in-depth documentaries on the criminal cases that continue to shape the American justice system.